So this one is a bit of a follow-on from my last video regarding the Quran burning story in Stockholm. So there was pushback from that incident. The Swedish embassy in Baghdad was attacked. Now I don't think there was any casualties. I don't think the crowd would have got beyond the compound. I imagine it was high security, particularly after what happened. Imagine they would have had sort of advance notice that this guy was going to go ahead with it. Nevertheless, it would have been a frightening experience for diplomat staff, which is why I think his actions were selfish. Not only foolish, but also selfish. I mean, it's one thing trying to make a point. I understand he was an Iraqi atheist, been in Sweden for years. It's one thing making a point saying, I want to show Islam's a violent religion. But it is an inflammatory act and it's potentially putting Swedish nationals abroad in danger, potentially also putting Iraqi atheists in danger, as they'll be tarred with the same brush. Now, like I said in the last video, it doesn't take much to trigger Islamist sensitivities. Um, and I'm not of the opinion that, we should be hypersensitive around it. That is not my view. But I still don't think you should poke the hornet's nest for the sake of it. That's just, it's not a practical move. It's not the best way, in my opinion, to confront extremism. Um, and the Swedish government was in a difficult position, currently headed by Ulf Kristersson. And it kind of gets to the point in this video, how should Western leaders deal with the Islamic world? So, on one hand, they have to defend freedom of expression. And this act, no matter how offensive or provocative it was defended by the Swedish legal system as an act of free expression. But the Swedish government was quick to condemn it, say that they were not part of it, and it was an act of Islamophobia. Um, Particularly, in terms of, I think they were particularly wanting the Turkish delegation to hear this because Erdogan has went out of his way to sort of block Sweden's potential membership of NATO, and he cited this, he cited the presence of Kurdish figures in Sweden as his reasoning for blocking Sweden's entry. But I think it needs to be very clear this was an act of an individual, not the Swedish state. And if Muslims don't want to be tarred with the same brush, then neither should Swedes or other nationalities. But there's actually more layers to this. It's not just about Sweden and Turkey. Give it its new name. This actually gets into the deeper issue of how the West more broadly should deal with the Islamic world more broadly. Now, I'm reluctant to talk about clash of civilizations. I think it's too simplistic. Because there will be nuances. We can't say the entire Islamic world is theologically ultra conservative because it's not. You will see big differences between. I was recently speaking to my Indonesian friend. I don't think she'll mind me mentioning this, and she knows of a woman who will wear the hijab during the day, but basically, um, she's pretty loose in other ways. And in some parts of the world, the hijab for women has become a fashion accessory. It's not even a symbol of piety. That would contrast greatly with more conservative societies where it is mandated. Despite what Muslim women may say in the West that it's all about free choice, it definitely isn't a choice for a lot of women in those countries, and it's a fallacy to claim that it is. I think actually quite insulting to those women to insist that it is a choice. But it doesn't take a lot to see sensitivities within Islam inflamed. Not long ago, it was one of the many situations between the French state and the Islamic world. I think it was after the murder of Samuel Paty, the teacher, that barbaric murder. Um, Macron very vocally defended, I think it was actually another Charlie Hebdo cartoon. I can't recall off the top of my head the precise situation that spawned this. But basically, Macron was defending French values and freedom of speech. And as a result of this, he was burnt in effigy. in cities across the Islamic world. Now, similar things happened to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. Um, this just reiterates that there is definitely an issue of values. I mean, Christianity gets mocked often in the Western world. I mean, off the top of my head, I could think of the Monty Python sketches mocking Christianity, the the cosplay of tarts and vicars that you get at some fancy dress situations in England. Maybe not so much today, but certainly in the 1990s. I mean, I remember actually there was a debate after Life of Brian, and the church was obviously not happy about it. But I remember during that debate, the bishop who was invited to the debate, I forget who it was, but he was debating Palin and Cleese, or I think it was Cleese actually, and he made a valid point. He said, they wouldn't have targeted Islam in this way because sort of the late 70s is when Islamic politicized Islam was starting to really come to the fore. And it is true, I think Christianity is an easier target for comedians. They know that the chances of them being slaughtered for mocking Christianity are far, far less. Okay, you may get some protest, and you may get, when the Da Vinci Code was made, there were protests outside Lincoln Cathedral. So there's protests. But when Islam is insulted, you can guarantee there will be threats of violence every time. Now, this is not to say that every Muslim responds that way. Some will just say, we don't agree with this, and that's a right. It's also freedom of speech to express a dislike of something or to say that you disagree with something. Swedish Muslims would have every right to say this is wrong and provocative. Um, they would not have a right to then, cross over into violence. So, for example, they could have a peaceful demonstration. Um, but that is the key word, isn't it? Peaceful. Um, I think people need to remember that leaders are in a position that ordinary citizens are not. This is not to say that ordinary citizens don't take risks. But this guy, he's not head of state, he's not head of government, he's an individual activist. So he can sort of afford to be a bit reckless, although it may well put his life in danger. But he's not the Swedish Prime Minister, he's not the King of Sweden. He doesn't have to represent a nation state in that way, deal with the Islamic world. He could sort of, you know, light the flame and then sit back a little bit. And that's why I think it's a bit selfish. The thing is, governments have to deal with these things. And when it comes to diplomacy, it's a bit like dealing with China. Relations are strained. But even the most difficult relations, there's still a sliver of communication. I suspect we even have it with Russia right now, even though relations are probably the worst they've ever been, possibly even worse than during the Cold War. But there will still be a sliver of communication going on. Um, because that is always there, in terms of, even if it's to compare notes and say, well, this was your move, that was our move. There's always a sliver of communication there, even when relations are strained. And I think it's the same with the Islamic world. In fact, during the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981, there were apparently diplomatic cables between the Islamists and the Carter administration. In fact, recently something interesting emerged. I won't talk too much about this because it's not really what the video is about, but it emerged that there were individuals in the Carter administration who have said that actually there was a deal between the Iranians, that is the Islamists, and the Reagan team. Bear in mind he was running for president, to basically make him look good. So a lot has been made of the fact that the American hostages were freed on the very day that Reagan was inaugurated in January 1981, and that was supposed to show the greatness of Ronald Reagan. Actually, it may well have been an underhand deal to make Carter look bad, even to help Reagan win the election. It sounds like a wild conspiracy theory, but this has sort of emerged recently as Jimmy Carter went into hospice, and a lot of his legacy was being assessed. This came up again. The problem is, it is one sided. So Reagan administration officials have denied that there was any such deal. Basically, the argument was that it was a deal with the Iranian hostage takers to release them on that day, in order to, it was related to the Iran-Contra scandal. But if that's true, it's awful because it prolonged the agony of those hostages. If it's true, it's a very, very cynical thing. But again, it gets into the complexities of the West and the Islamic world. Thinking of Britain, we have quite good relations with some Islamic countries. For example, Jordan. That's through the royal families. The British royal family and the Jordanian royal family have pretty good relations. Morocco, I think we've got reasonably good relations. Egypt, fairly good relations, but goes up and down. Um, but the thing is, the sensitivities of Islam are such that even if there's good political relations, all it takes is someone fanning the flames, and that could really, put relations down. And that's why it's important the governments are very, very assertive about this. I think when you get a deliberate act like Quran burning, it is important the government say this is not us. We're not condoning this. Now that may sound like pandering to sensitivities, but it's important to put it on record because Islamists will use that as propaganda and say, look, this proves the West is they all hate Muslims, which is of course rubbish. One of the biggest recruiting drives for young men to join terrorist groups is that the West persecutes and hates Muslims. And this was used by Al Qaeda, it's been used by ISIS, it's been used by every Islamist terror group there is. Um, Basically, the narrative of you are the victims and the West is out to get you. That's why it's so important that it is put on the record that an individual Quran burner doesn't represent the Swedish government. But I think it is equally important that the West ascertain its own values. So, for example, a few years ago when Erdogan and other leaders, I believe the others were Imran Khan and Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia, who are also mouthpieces who self-appointed, spokespeople of the Islamic world, they wanted to introduce a sort of blasphemy motion at UN level, which would have meant that in New York City at the top level, other diplomats would have been subjected to, do not offend Islam narratives. I think, I don't know how much that was resisted, but I hope it was. Um, I mean, it's the most obnoxious form of supremacy to say we demand respect, but we are going to impose our values on you. So, if Erdogan doesn't want Western values imposed on Turkey, then what right does he have to impose Islamic values at UN level, such as blasphemy sensitivities? He sure as hell doesn't represent all Turks. This recent election victory is very questionable, um, particularly given how many journalists have been arrested in Turkey over the years. Erdogan's pretty much a dictator, or at least he's one step down from that, worst sort of autocrat. And he's definitely wants to be a dictator. Um, and I think many moderate Turks are very concerned about the direction the country's going in under this man. I'd say he's one of the most important leaders in the world and one of the most dangerous because he's in a very unique position. He's a NATO leader, but he's also a Muslim. He's representing an Islamic country. And Turkey is not a small country. It's an important middle power country. Um, but this question of how far should leaders go, I do not believe we should pander to sensitivities. And I think that there's a big difference between, for example, someone deliberately trying to provoke by burning a Quran versus, for example, a teacher, as was this case in Wakefield not long ago, a teacher giving a lesson in religious studies and talking about the issue of blasphemy and then being forced into hiding, or a schoolboy accused of scruffing a Quran and then being forced into hiding. Situations like that. Or I think of the murder of Samuel Paty in France. Barbarism, absolute barbarism. Now, it is right that the French state should take a zero tolerance approach to that. And, did Erdogan condemn that? Maybe he did. I'm not sure that he did. So it should be a case of respect is a two-way street, but I'm not sure that the Islamic world wants equal treatment. I think there is a supremacist notion. And I think this is testified by the fact that almost without exception, minorities are persecuted in Islamic countries. I mean, atheists and Christians have been killed in their thousands, persecuted in the thousands. There is simply no comparison between anything Muslims go through in the West versus what happens in Islamic countries. The worst example of Islamophobic hate in modern times is probably the Srebrenica massacre in the context of a brutal civil war. Um, but some of the worst atrocities committed against Muslims have been by other Muslims. I mean, this Sunni Shia schism is somewhat, and I'm speaking in broad terms here, comparable to the Catholic Protestant schism of the 16th century, the European Wars of Religion, exemplified by the French Wars of Religion and the 30 Years' War. Very bloody, very costly conflicts. Um, but today, the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury are never going to have a major public feud, and if they did, it would be watered down immediately. The ecumenism is very strong. Whereas when it comes to Sunni Shia, we see violent, costly proxy wars, such as in Yemen. So I genuinely believe that Islam is literally behind the Western world in that sense. And until it catches up, there is going to be clashes. I don't want to talk about a clash of civilizations, but there is simply no comparison between a situation where people can be lynched for alleged blasphemy versus not being lynched for alleged blasphemy. Um, I mean, Christians may get annoyed by insult to Christianity, but in the vast majority of cases, with perhaps some exceptions in Orthodox Russia or Africa, certainly in Western Europe, fundamentalist Christians, they might be vocal, they might be even be bigoted, but there's just no comparison in terms of the consequences of insult. Um, and I'm aware that some far right types will kind of appropriate Christianity or say that they're acting in the name of Christianity, but fundamentally they're neo nationalists, they're not driven by theology. Whereas Islamists, there may be nationalistic components, but they're fundamentally driven by theology. That's the difference. That's why I've always rejected this notion that the IRA in the Troubles were Christian terrorists, because yes, there was a sectarianism between Protestants and Catholics. That was a big, big component. But, the primary focus of the IRA was territorial, that in their view, Northern Ireland should be part of United Ireland. But getting back to this issue of dealing with the Islamic world, I don't think it can be ignored. I think that, you get situations where, for example, let's say a British national gets in trouble in Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Well, having good relations with those governments pays off in terms of negotiating their release. There's situations like that where it could be advantageous. But it's balancing out its diplomacy, which is important, with also maintaining actually we also have our values and we're not going to pander to what you consider sensitive. There is freedom of speech in the West, and part of that includes the right to debate religious theology. In other words, Islam is not above criticism. Even the character of Muhammad as a historic figure is not above criticism, no matter how important he is. So, the Prophet is not above criticism as a historic figure. I mean, he was a warlord, and there's a lot of aspects of his biography that are questionable. There is no question about it that Islam was spread by the sword, not just Muhammad, but also Tamerlane in the 14th century. So, actually, early 15th century. There's no question about it. Islam has had a very violent history. And any Muslim who says otherwise, they're either ignorant of history or they're simply lying. They're trying to promote the false propaganda. This is why Islam is peace is a cruel fallacy. And I think even many Muslims realize that isn't true. But it's all part of the propaganda. So I think when Muslim leaders insist that this is the narrative, it needs to be rejected. I'm not saying that, Sunak and Macron and Maloney, go out and say, no, we disagree, Islam is violent. But I think there has to be an honest acknowledgement that Islam has a problem with violence that does stand out from other religions. It exceeds other religions. Every religion has its extremists, but you simply don't see the sort of pan pan global situation of extremism with other religions as you do with Islam. I maintain that because the spread of ISIS, the spread of Al Qaeda, the sort of global reach that those organizations have, there's no comparison. You may get fundamentalist Baptists who are spreading homophobia in Africa. But I'm talking about terrorism. I'm talking about specifically this death cult, where young men feel they need to blow themselves up to meet virgins in the afterlife and take as many disbelievers as they can with them, or who go around hostages and ask who is Muslim and who is not, or slaughter someone for alleged blasphemy. Um, you can find extremism in every religion. I've always said that. I mentioned Christian fundamentalists in India. There's Hindu extremism that exists, and it's a growing problem. But I still think that Islam has a particularly obvious problem with hypersensitivity, and I think that we need to resist it. I think that those who try to silence debate by smearing people as Islamophobes because they question this, it's incredibly dangerous. I think that when you get elected politicians like Humza Yousaf in Scotland, who, would absolutely insist that we don't be offensive and we tread carefully. And, I honestly believe if that man had his way, he would introduce blasphemy laws to make it legal to criticize Islam. The domestic politics won't allow it, but I don't trust him. And I think that he would, given half a chance. Um, this is very dangerous. I think that any politician, any elected figure who sort of correlates sensitivity, religious sensitivity, with legislation, if it comes down to sort of like you cannot question religion, that really needs to be robustly pushed back on. Now, having said that, religious people have a right to defend their religion, and if people are insulting it willfully, they've also got the freedom of speech to say that's wrong. We disagree with that. And I've never really I've never had a problem with Muslims or Christians or Sikhs or Jews talking about their religion. That's different than imposing it. And I think there's a bit of conflation there. I think some atheists themselves can be too sensitive. They hear God or Allah and they lose their rag. It works both ways. Freedom of speech is for everyone. But as soon as you use that position to take away the rights of others, that's when it's a problem. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But basically, Western leaders really need to get this balance right. Yes, be diplomatic. Yes, condemn unnecessary provocation, but also insist that we will show zero tolerance to Islamists in our midst. And I think we give them far too much ground. I think, for example, there's been footage of Islamists in London openly calling for the death of unbelievers, disbelievers, kafirs, on Facebook, the way Facebook regulates. I've seen Islamists openly, spewing out anti-Semitic bile. Nothing happens to them. Those posts stay up. Question is why. So there is a lack of consistency here. I think that anyone recorded on the streets of Britain, making terroristic threats or talking about Islamic dominance, I think they should be immediately investigated by the police. Um, and if need be, deported. I think we need to take this very, very seriously because all the terrorist attacks we've had, it always came about from, well, this person was on the radar, but, you know, they somehow got away with it because they weren't prioritized. So we need to take it very, very seriously. And I think one last point, I think community leaders that don't work with the government, they say that the Prevent program is Islamophobic. Well, the Prevent program targets far right extremists as well. So targets white supremacists. It's a counter-extremism program. It's not an anti-Islam program. So Muslim community leaders who put out that narrative, they are part of the problem because they're making it harder for the government to de-radicalize young minds. I think the government needs to be supporting that. Let me know your thoughts.